Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, trying to remember who I am today, joined by Mr. Josh NEAL, and very happy that it is so. Today we will be talking about psychology, the psychology of some of the issues that we are confronting here in this world of ours. Let me get my notes in place. As many of you will know, because of a clip I did recently, it's the first of the strategy clips. I hope to apply some of the things that I learned working in communications, branding, advertising, and marketing in pursuit of a communications strategy for the so-called dissonant right. There are a number of different angles that I hope to come at this from, and a number of different people that I'd like to talk to. But at the outset, there is the idea of reaching a particular group of people. And when you when you want to get serious about that, there is what is called segmentation, where you try to break down your audience groups. But there does seem to be a certain group of let's say, psychographic features that just about everyone that we might wish to reach will be dealing with. And these could be said to include things like shame, things like guilt. And there is the question of overcoming guilt, overcoming shame, looking at ways that these things have been inculcated. There's also the idea of overcoming denial. And there's the idea also of guilt that maybe is unwarranted, and helping people to, so to speak, let go of it, put it down, recognize that it is not theirs, and to separate themselves from that weight, which seems to be something of a means of psychological leverage to drive people in different directions, that sort of thing. So that's sort of a quick gloss of what I'll be talking with Josh about today. One of the things that we do in the world of corporate communications is bring in subject matter experts. Now, I have that's rather challenging when you are talking about this kind of subject, because many people will not go anywhere near it. Josh has a background with graduate level studies in psychology, practicing hypnotherapist, and there's of course Josh's own experiences, having been slapped about by circumstances in this respect. He's I actually, in my first clip where I was talking about strategy, I mentioned him, and I was saying that I'd had him on the channel. I realized now, no, I hadn't. He had me on his channel, and that channel was shortly thereafter canceled. So he's been through all sorts of excitement with that. I'd like to welcome you, Josh, before I go through some quick shilling stuff, and just say thank you very much for coming on today. And is there anything else you wanted to say in terms of introducing yourself in your own words?
Well, I'll just say thanks for having me. I think you're a very fascinating guy. I mean, that's why I asked you on my show many moons ago. I think the work you do is very interesting. It's a unique perspective that not a lot of people come from, and that's why I got involved in this in the first place, was to find people and ideas that I couldn't come across any other way. So yeah, I'm just happy to be here. As far as what I do, or pertinent shillings, I did recently publish this book with Imperium Press. It's selling like hotcakes. #1 seller for the publisher, fastest selling book that they've ever released. They've got a great back catalog. So check out imperiumpress.org. They got a podcast now on Joel Davis's channel. What else can I show real quick? Tyler Hamilton, his EBL thing is still going, so check out him. But yeah, happy to be here, happy to be part of the series. I think it'll be a tremendous success.
Well, I'm just going to go ahead and put this up larger on screen so people can see it. This was the only graphic I was able to find. This is the book that Josh held up. So take a look and check out American Extremist. As I said, he's been put through the ringer in a number of respects with all of this. So he brings a very, let's say, a real perspective to it, immediate experience of a lot of these circumstances that are involved. So my quick shilling, please do check out my book. You can find it on Amazon. This is Vinculum. It's a sci-fi. And that's the problem with these Mac covers. Every time I pick it up, I get a fingerprint on it. Forgive me, vile. But you can find that on Amazon under Oliver Perrin. There are my collected poems. You can find that under Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth, Oliver Timken-Perrin. That's on Amazon as well. I am on Minds. I'm on Gab. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Telegram. There's probably Gab. Did I say that? There's, yeah, for those who wish to support the channel, I must tap that quickly. There's GoFundMe, and there is Subscribestar, and these people here, whom I will now share, are the Praetorian Chads who make all of this possible. Thanks to all of them, one and all. And as you can see what it says there, all of the credit and none of the blame. So I guess, Josh, to start with this, as I said, when we're doing work in the realm of communications, you bring in people to help establish some perspective. And, this is like an exercise with a series of gates, right? So by that, I mean that, we can narrow it down in terms of segmentation, like I was talking about, whether we're talking to boomers or to, whichever generational cohort, Gen X, millennials, Zoomers. There is also the aspect of male or female. You could break it down by race, gender, household income, whatever. But this, as I said, this fundamental idea that you've got a group of people who are in denial about the circumstances around them. For example, people who want to lap from the little bowl of white guilt, or people who believe that multiculturalism is the best thing ever and doesn't present any unique challenges, and all it's done is make us stronger because diversity is, of course, our strength. There's a certain amount of denial going on in that. As I said, there's also a considerable amount of guilt used as leverage. So overcoming denial is one aspect, dealing with guilt is another. So if you were to say, imagine that, in the course of this exercise we're going through here, that you've got a group of people who will in future be working to develop communication strategies. And this primary gate in terms of how we're going to reach people is definitely to some extent going to involve recognizing that they're, owning things that they have been at least silently complicit in, so that's an aspect of overcoming denial. Separating them from guilt that they experience that is perhaps unwarranted in the sense of collective guilt simply for being white. But at the same time, there's also the dimension of, wow, if I overcome the denial and recognize that, maybe I didn't have it all figured out, the sort of the red pill experience that everybody goes through. They're like, well, I mean, there's some few super Praetorian Chads who have marched about, they were born red pilled or whatever, but many people, myself certainly included, I had a whole set of perspectives. And despite the fact that I thought of myself as being very much a freewheeling free thinker, I had to come to terms with the fact that there was a whole lot that I had missed, so when that comes around, perhaps new guilt comes in, as a result of, having overcome the denial and looked at what the situation is. So, if you had to talk to a group of people who were going to be working over a period of time to reach people who might be dealing with guilt, denial, shame, etc., how would you go about acquainting them with this landscape and sharing with them best practices, ways that this is approached in therapy, in counseling, across the realms of psychology in general?
Well, major task there.
Right.
Well, first I'd like to
small
say,
ask, right?
First, I'd like to say it's pretty amazing you got Bill Hicks to be one of your Praetorian Super Chads from the grave, donating to your channel. So yeah. I got to say that's quite impressive.
Looks like we got ourselves a reader. Yeah.
Well, I guess to be a party pooper, the first thing I would say is I really take issue with this idea of dissident right, for a couple of reasons. It may be factually true that we're dissident in a certain sense. It's not really, I think, in any way comparable to like the Soviet experience, where you were literally disappeared overnight. So it's kind of like a similar thing with like the white genocide meme. Like it is factually and technically true if you are comparing the actual definition and perhaps the consequences with with reality, but people have a certain schema of it in their mind, which automatically detonates the argument that you're trying to make. So
Right.
you say things like, well,
we're not in cattle cars, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so it has a certain lack of persuasive power, and since that's what we're doing here, we are trying to persuade people. That's something to keep in mind. I mean, I guess we're all nominally right-wing. I don't like to think of myself that way. I certainly don't like to think of myself as a dissident. And quick shill for the book again, it's one of the arguments I make here is that, we are normal. We are the normal people. Our attitudes, are the way we think about things, constitute, the true political center in the United States. And even a lot of the people that we would seek to sway to our way of thinking kind of represent that too. So I don't want to throw up too many obstacles between myself and somebody that I'm trying to kind of connect with about these issues, because there's already plenty there, and I kind of see the task as removing as many of these obstacles before the conversation begins, as a way to kind of maximize the persuasive ability. There was this guy got a lot of press in 2016 because supposedly the Hillary campaign had hired him to develop their marketing and their political rhetoric. Robert Cialdini wrote 2 very famous books on influence and persuasion. One in the 80s called Influence, I think, and then in 2016, Persuasion. And that's kind of the idea that I'm putting forth here, which is you want to kind of front load the argument or the campaign that you're presenting with. It's kind of already got a certain influence to it before you're coming to the conversation, and some of that requires taking away these things that would create obstacles, create reasons for people to get out of the conversation, so to speak. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say, and this is maybe a little bit more descriptive than prescriptive, is just to kind of understand why these things are happening the way they are. It's not like guilt and shame or modern psychological phenomenon, or that they only come from capitalism or neoliberalism, but we have if you want to think of it in like a philosophical sense, there is a certain tradition, assuming that you accept this argument in the first place, which I guess is contentious to begin with. But Foucault, down to Deleuze, down to Chul Han, make this argument that power has had a different way of operating on populations to create the kinds of, I don't know, I don't want to be too cynical here, cattle, populist mass man that they want. And, Foucault said that we had sovereign power going down to disciplinary power, which was characterized by a certain set of things. I'm not trying to do like a one-on-one lecture here, but just to set it up. And then Deleuze kind of talks about how, one of the issues was disciplinary power is confinement. You have prisons, you have schools, people are in these physical enclosures where power is imposed upon them. Deleuze said you get into societies of control where it's not really like that. People move from these enclosures to open spaces. And so in disciplinary society, it's somebody or something weighing down on you with a set of impositions and rules and morals and things like that that's forced upon you. For Deleuze, it's something that becomes internal. So there's like a self-censorship, a self-reinforcing of whatever the moral code, the behavioral prescriptions that the society wants you to have, because you're no longer in these fixed places like a prison, a medical hospital, a school, whatever the case. You're out and you're moving from institution to institution. Byung-Chul Han comes along, and I find this to be very persuasive. Basically says that there's a further innovation from this, and pardon me while I put on my old man glasses, because I am getting to that age. We move to they're all dirty. We move from kind of these societies of control to a transparency society. Power and authority are your friends. It's not actually something that's an imposition anymore. It's actually something that it's an invitation. And with that, there's an introduction to free will and choice, that you're choosing to be part of this thing. Rather, if we go into the 1700s, you have to do it because of the king or the parliament or whatever would made you think, act, pray in a certain way, and if you didn't do that, there would be strict punishments. Now it's, you're invited to do these things. You're invited because you're optimizing your market value, you're maximizing your personal happiness, what do they say, the young kids now, you're looks maxing, you're doing all of these things, you're taking on all of these kinds of codes and prescriptions because it's good for you. And authority is your friend that wants you to do well, right? It's the school teacher that doesn't rap your knuckles with the ruler anymore. They're your best friend. They won't raise their voice. They won't use mean language, things like that. So we've kind of moved to this transparency society where people are kind of participants in their own exploitation. So the thing that Byung-Chul Han says is that, what we're dealing with is psychopolitics. That the kind of regime that we're dealing with, and you probably know this from your background, communications, advertising, marketing, where the goal really is to get at your spirit and to control your spirit, to control your desires, to manipulate your will, and that's kind of how it operates. So people now are exploiting themselves. I think we would say they're being exploited externally as well, but now there's a new dimension of it where you're willfully self-exploiting. OnlyFans. Trying to think of less sexist comparisons.
Well, I'll throw one at you. No, well, two actually. There's a famous one, and I maybe mentioned it to you because I think when we talked before, I might have brought this book up, but I used to hammer it all the time. I'll do it again. It's called Buildings and Power: Freedom and Control in the Origin of Modern Building Types, and they show how the basic ideas of structuralism. Well, it's cute, but a lot of that in terms of shaping behavior, structuralism as applied to anthropology, society, and all the rest, is that the buildings that you occupy and move through, that they yield a structure. In the case of like Bentham's panopticon, or prison construction, there's a very real thing. You can look at the circular shape of it, the central tower in the middle, the way that the cells are all open to the central tower and can be watched, right? You have no privacy. That shapes your behavior. But that old system where you would have like, a guy with a ring of keys waiting at a door and, moving beyond that door, you'd have a long hallway with individual cells, each of which had a lock on its door. That's a very mechanical, physical way of describing sort of the old system, like you were talking about with Foucault. If anybody's interested in that, you can take a look at his books like Discipline and Punish, which cover these themes. But then you move on to a different model, and the example used in this book I was talking about is at this point now an older part of the Charles de Gaulle airport, where they have these big open areas, big open sort of spaces, cylindrical, and then within them are these tubes that you move through that are transparent glass. And so as you move through what are essentially human hamster or habitrail tubes, they're clear, they're transparent. So you feel that you have this vast open space around you on all sides, and yet you're actually moving through this tube that is transparent to give you the feeling of freedom, whereas the trajectory you can follow is very tightly constrained. A second example of how this sort of more invisible manipulation happens is the idea of the circus ring, which is just absolutely brilliant. Everybody has to know about this one. Because what happens is when they train these animals that you see in like a 3-ring circus, each one of those rings was a fenced-in enclosure in which those animals were trained. And they're a circular enclosure, and they're a fence that would go up, as high as a tiger can jump, frankly. So, and these are 18, 20, 30 foot high, really, really high circular cages. I shouldn't say circular, I should say cylindrical, as high up as they run, right? And these animals are trained day in and day out inside this circular cage and it's precisely the same dimensions of the circus ring that's used under the tent. So what happens is they take the animal out of the cage and they put them in the tent with all the people, and all they leave is a signifier of the fence, which is the ring upon the ground that we still remember as a 3-ring circus, but that's animal training. And so it becomes a boundary that they don't cross because it's been inculcated in them. So yeah, definitely I can see the way in which there's sort of an invisible thing where we're invited, the carrot rather than the stick. But the mechanisms of constraint, even though they may be, invisible to us now, they're still very, very real. But I'm sorry, you
Yeah.
were going somewhere.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's I'd never thought about the circus one. That's interesting. But yeah, so OnlyFans, you're invited. Even the kind of like this is another Foucauldian idea: technology of the self entrepreneurship of the self. So you're invited to be your own personal Elon Musk or Tony
Build your
Stark.
personal brand.
Yeah, right, exactly. And there's all kinds of self-exploitative actions you have to do to get into that. When I was building up my therapy practice, other than the fact that I got canceled being the reason that it failed, but one of the other reasons it was not doing as you know as well as I would have liked is all these kinds of willful self-exploitative things that you have to do. Well, you have to use this particular social media platform. You need to post certain times a day, and you need to present a certain image of yourself, right? And so there's a voyeuristic aspect where part of cultivating your brand and expanding your reach is letting people into your life. But that act takes on, this is something I actually get into in book 3 of this book, which is what I call the public private self, where like it's a little bit of a dance. I'm showing you what I'm like on the inside, but it's not really what I'm like, because it's a kind of a simulacra of myself that I'm creating in this artificial digital landscape to give you the impression that this is who I'm like and this is what I do, and you can do it too, and you're part of it just because you're passively observing it on your screen and liking and commenting and things like that. So it's not immediately it's a weird kind of self-contradicting thing, because maybe now more than ever people feel a sense of being violated and exploited, and there's constant demonstrations, and the political culture is very much fixed on that kind of, I know this is a naughty word for a lot of people, but like neo-Marxist kind of rhetoric. I don't think that's wrong to say on a certain kind of metalogical level. Maybe it's not even Marxist really, but that's certainly the person we think of as presenting that way of viewing the world to us. So at a time when we're more conscious of that, or at least we verbalize it more, people are also less, because there's that element of choice, people have a deep ambivalence about the relationships they have to themselves, to others, to exploitation, to power, to the society around them. And that makes it very difficult. And so it's not really just, this is one of the reasons like the Ben Shapiro thing of facts don't care about your feelings is ultimately, I think, weak, not incorrect, but weak, is because first, the irrational dominates over the rational. Secondly, people are, and this is a Freudian concept, the one of probably the worst psychological demon that a person can be inflicted with in terms of self-development, conduct, things like that, is ambivalence, because you're torn between two poles, and there's no forward movement. There's just kind of like this lateral side-to-side movement back and forth, and people actually never develop morally, socially. They can't advance themselves in any of the ways that they would like. So descriptively, I think those are the things to keep in mind. Let's put the glasses back on here. Those are the things to keep in mind, because that's kind of why we are where we're at. So if you're coming to somebody as a right-wing guy or lady, a gentleman or lady, or somewhere in between, you're the coercive force, in stark contrast to this invitational neoliberal hegemony that is giving you the impression, the false image of being a peer, of participating, of choosing to be engaged in this kind of activity. So you're presenting this coercive thing. Liberal hegemony is more invitational. You're kind of all from before the interaction even begins, you're on the losing side of the argument, because you're putting forth all of these thou shalts, all of these very strong determinative prescriptions that, superficially neoliberal hegemony doesn't do. And again, there's an inherent contradiction in that, because all power has prescriptions and it has expectations of you, but what I think Byung-Chul Han called friendly Big Brother, like the Orwellian Big Brother was spooky, mean, oppressive, dastardly. The modern Big Brother is, a pretty rainbow flag. And
Yeah, well, there's an angle of that. There's a book I'd recommend to everybody. It's called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance by Ioan Culianu. He was a Romanian who escaped the Ceausescu regime. He was a specialist in philosophy and magic and religion. And in this book, he traces the erotic as a tool for manipulation. So he starts out with Stoic theories of the pneuma and how images were transmitted. He looks at some Aristotelian stuff as well. He moves up into the Renaissance, the art of memory. People who were great manipulators like Giordano Bruno coming in with theories of the soul and sort of Neoplatonic magic in the sense of sympathies within the world soul and this sort of thing. But at any rate, it's a fascinating historical journey. But what he comes to in the end is the idea that during the Reformation, there was an efflorescence of images, many of which were erotic. And this is understood in the broadest sense of erotic. So not just sexual, but the idea, like you would see in psychology, eros, the idea of a projected element that needs to be re-internalized. It's thought of as being something separate from the self, but because it cannot be recognized as a part of the self, it's outside, but it exhibits an attractive force, and you attempt to re-internalize that thing. Like when you hear some woman going, I need to go keep an eye on my man. When you hear the woman talking like that, or a man talking about my woman, right? It's a projected part of themselves that they don't see as being entirely separate, and unconsciously they're driven to re-internalize it. That's what I mean when I'm talking about eros in this broad sense. It's the idea of a fragmented self that is not understood as a whole, that's projected onto others, but then because the thing wants to become a whole again, the person is driven unconsciously to acquire and keep this quote unquote other that's really just a screen upon which they project their desires. So when I say eros and the erotic, that's what I'm talking about. And so Culianu arrives sort of at the end of this book saying that there's this efflorescence of erotic imagery, and there's quite a bit going on there. And then what you have is a counter-reformation, and you get dour Catholic counter-reformation Habsburgs dressed all in black, and an almost iconoclastic rejection of imagery, and the idea that we don't need beautiful paintings and the rest. We should have if we're going to show anything beautiful, it'll be the woodworking on a Quaker chair, and everything should be super simple. Well, in the course of describing what seems to be a reaction to imagery and an attempt to lock it down, basically he asserts that there was a kind of a war on the imagination. And in the course of this, the main part, I forgot the ligature between what I'm telling you about the book and the main point. Hopefully it will come back to me, but I'll get to the main point specifically, is that in the course of this entire development, there came a time when the people who exercised control recognized that the old model of the police state, which you kind of tapped on earlier with the direct imposition of force, all this stuff with Foucault, that it was essentially a waste of time, that there were far more efficient ways to manage people. And that was to inculcate systems of control within them through what he, given his perspective, characterizes as a kind of sorcery or erotic magic, the deployment of imagery, and the sense that you're not complete, and in order to be complete, you must incorporate these things, and therefore you're driven to do it. And so what he posits is the idea that the police state was replaced with something that he very specifically calls the magician state, and that it essentially moves behind the scenes using imagery. And when I say erotic, that can include the term aspirational, because you want to be something else, and you see that thing that you must pursue in order to get to be this complete thing that you've been taught you need to be, whether that's having X number of followers while you bounce your boobies on OnlyFans or whatever it might be. And so somehow the magician state, focused upon imagery and manipulation in that way, replaced the police state, and is far more efficient because people don't see it. There is no immediate mechanism of physical control.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a way older idea than just some German nerds from 10 years ago. Yeah, so it's based on the principle of association, a very old, associative school psychology going back over 100 years. If you want to kind of reframe some of the things you said in psychoanalytic language, the repetition compulsion, that's what's driving these people to kind of confront shadow archetypes of who they are. So yeah, it's very old. I would imagine it's existed since time immemorial. It's just that the intensity level of these techniques is the volume is much higher. The kind of ubiquity of screens and images is much more intense. So it's not really that anything is different. There are certain kind of like micro innovations, but it's just the profundity of these techniques, I think, is incalculably greater
Right.
than
So
maybe preceding.
Major quantitative shift rather than a real qualitative one.
Precisely. So having set the table here, I do want to talk a little bit about some of these specific emotions that you mentioned. So let's start with guilt. And kind of keeping in the Foucauldian kind of way of thinking about these things, guilt is the kind of guilt that we're dealing with is the result of what Foucault or Hahn would call a technique of responsibilizing. So, and I think that is something that is a necessary consequence of extreme sociopathic individualistic society. I think it's something that is a consequence of the kind of maybe the founding stock kind of hyper-religious Anglo temperament that founded the United States. Don't push me too far on that, but look, we see with the conservative impulse, like the bootstrapism, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, just work harder. You can be a millionaire too. Gosh darn it, if you just log enough hours at the end of every day. Don't kiss wifey on the forehead. Don't pat little Timmy on the head. Work. And it's kind of the same attitude. So guilt, in one sense, can be seen as if you're confronted with something that you think you can't do anything to counteract. Let's just say that that's the scene that a person is confronted with. There's something, a challenge, whatever the case might be, for whatever reason, you don't feel that it can be resisted. There's two options, really. Well, I guess three. The third path would be recognizing that something can be done and doing that, whatever it might be. Option number one, though, is a kind of helplessness and disempowerment. Option number two is guilt. And depending on your kind of temperament and maybe the culture around you, and certainly the American, like heritage American mentality would be guilt. I didn't do enough. If I hadn't done X, Y, Z, this wouldn't have happened. Like a responsibilizing, right? Like I could have done something differently in the future. I could use, this is my fault. Which is a kind of oddly empowering psychological approach than learned helplessness, because learned helplessness is despair, it's nihilism, pity. I can't do anything. Woe is me. Nobody really wants to feel that way. Nobody with an asterisk, I should say. Most people don't really want to feel that way, but there's an empowerment with guilt, which is kind of maybe not immediately intuitive to most people, because we think of guilt as this crushing negative force, but there's like secondary, I would even argue primary benefits to guilt, in that what it does to your self-concept. So you don't feel disempowered, you don't feel helpless. In fact, you feel a kind of pride. So guilt and pride are almost like kissing cousins in this regard, in terms of how it defends the self-concept that the person has. So this is an excerpt from a study by the Harvard Business Review on the secondary or primary benefits of guilt. Despite their differences, pride, shame, and guilt all activate similar neural circuits, including the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the insula, the nucleus accumbens, all regions of the prefrontal limbic fore and midbrain. Interestingly, pride is the most powerful of these emotions at triggering activity in these regions, except in the nucleus accumbens, where guilt and shame win out. This explains why it can be so appealing to heap guilt and shame on ourselves. They're activating the brain's reward center. So this is one of the other hurdles that somebody who would want to kind of reach the other side, perform some political exorcism on people who are ensnared by liberal intersectionality have to understand is that it's not just like, oh, these people are brainwashed. It's not just these people don't, like, in an Aristotelian way, they don't know enough. If they knew more information, they would be different or better. It's actually the intrinsic kind of dopaminergic systems of the brain are reinforcing it. So that is the choice element I'd like to bring back into this, or at least the internally self-reinforcing aspect of these kinds of problems, which is people are invited to participate, to accept power and the dictates of power. And again, in a Foucauldian way, because our overlords are masters of biopolitics, they know. The social science, the project of social sciences over the last 100, 200 years has been understanding the internal workings medically, psychiatrically of the human body for the purposes of greater power. And again, maybe that you could challenge that statement, but from a Foucauldian sense, power, you could say maybe they're doing it for knowledge, power and knowledge in a Foucauldian sense, two sides of the same coin. So
in any sense, I mean, power has never been anything but knowledge applied.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. It's not just like, if I show you the right meme, present the proper argument, this person will eventually change. It's that there's a holistic biopsychological phenomenon that's keeping this person in the thrall of kind of techno-capital neoliberal hegemony. I can keep going on.
I want to stick a pin directly in this thing and mark it. I love the expression political exorcism. That's excellent. But I want to try to qualify what you said here and see if we can turn it into a bullet point, right? Because if I were doing a strategy session, I'd be standing up at a whiteboard, looking politely at everyone as they speak, and I'd be attempting to distill these things and stick them up there so they can be used, right? Because the output of this process that we're engaged in is hopefully going to be a set of guidelines and tools, right? So if I'm understanding you correctly, and this is interesting because I hadn't considered it, the idea is that someone who's approaching another person who's dealing with guilt is that you're going to show up like the great you're going to be like Moses freeing the slaves. You're going to be like, look, you don't have to feel guilty. You can come with me. Set all that aside, right? There's no need for you to carry this burden. That's nonsense. Lighten yourself up. Be free like me. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what I'm hearing you say, so what you're saying is that essentially the guilt is a net positive for them in a couple of dimensions. First off, insofar as they don't have to achieve, and there's no requirement for the measurable success. In fact, the lack of the measurable success is something that acts as the trigger for the guilt, but the guilt is like a retrospective way to affect, and that's with an A, like pretend to have agency. So they get all the benefits of feeling as though they are a proper agent with a capital A, responsible and shaping their environment around them. But there's almost like a little trap in there insofar as they don't actually have to succeed, but by going through the retrospective exercise of figuring out what they must have done wrong and knowing they were responsible for it by God, they can sort of pay lip service to the Protestant idea of, like as you framed it very loosely, if a bunch of Protestants want to come in and raise hell with me about their doctrine, that's fine. But as a quick gloss, essentially the guilt is like a net positive for underachievers, insofar as it allows them to continue to affect agency, to pretend that they have this ability to shape the world around them, but there's no demand that they actually shape anything at all. So they can almost, instead of looking to the future or the present that they have shaped around them, they can stare at the past, the ways in which they have failed to do various things or failed to make the grade, and yet even so, enjoy this sense of being people who, if they'd only thought about it differently, could have done it. You know, it's like it's having agency and having a role without actually being required to get anything done. The second thing that, and I'll turn it over to you to tell me if I'm getting that right, and if there are any further things you do to would add to dimensionalize it. The other thing is that I think, based on what you said at the outset, this has to be conceived of as paired with that learned helplessness that you described, because they seem to be, you know how the bully and the coward are always a set. You know, a coward requires a bully.
Right.
It's necessary. Likewise, the bully requires the coward, and they are within that erotic projected process that I was talking about, you know, very broadly construed, going all the way back to ideas of Renaissance sorcery. But within that erotic process, the bully is terrified of the coward within himself and must project that part of himself outwards and cannot accept it as his own, and thereby despises it, but must be drawn into contact with it and then wants to beat it up. And so you can almost see the bully beating up the image of himself that he wants nothing to do with. Likewise, I would add, because it's not as straightforward as one of them is good and the other's bad, because it takes two to tango, the coward has a bully within him that he can only experience externally. And so hopefully that makes sense when we come back around to this idea that you brought up of learned helplessness versus the idea of the guilty party who's like, you know, well, I mean, guilt is something that I take upon myself, even though the person with learned helplessness didn't do shit. And the person who's feeling guilty didn't do shit. The pose of feeling guilty about what wasn't done, rather than just saying, it's not my fault, I didn't do nothing, right? You see how they're a set, they're a pair. So you can almost see the middle class, you know, Sarah Lawrence college educated female, right? Across from, you know, urethra or rotunda, you know, and the interaction between these two and how they form these two halves of a set. Was I tracking with where you were going?
100%, 100%.
Right.
And you threw some of your own sauce on there that wasn't mine in the first place. So awesome.
All right. I'm just please continue, but I want to make a couple notes about this because I'm trying to bullet point this stuff out. So please go on. Even though I'm not looking, I'm listening.
Yeah. So I mean, to skip to the end for a second, since you kind of got us halfway there already, you know, in a Jungian sense, I mean, what you're talking about is, you know, Jung would use the phrase an antidromion, which is, you know, the way something transmutes into its opposite, right? And that's kind of, you know, Jung talked about the archetype of the self as being the highest archetype. If you read Jung, he has like a whole literature on, you know, just very briefly, Christ would be an archetype of the self as the highest development of the individual. You know, the Godhead is a kind of archetype of the self through which people can, in an antidromian way, yin yang, shadow, other, all that kind of stuff becomes folded back into itself, reintegrated, and people are psychologically, spiritually whole in that way. You know, that's the result, I think. I mean, that's what has to be kept in mind if you're trying to really sway anybody, is that you have to keep in mind, like, where the end of this project is, what people need to do to get to that end point. It's obviously very difficult. Most people never accomplish it, and not to be fatalist and kind of dismiss your whole project before it even gets its, you know, knee deep into the water, so to speak. But there has to be a certain kind of recognition that we're putting a really daunting task in front of people. And again, one of the things that I mentioned in this book is that this is not our responsibility. Yeah, it's not our responsibility. It's our responsibility insofar as it's the time that we live in. It's the spirit of the age, because of our certain maybe delusions about democracy and individuality and all these kinds of things. It's a real delusion because we actually have to deal with the consequences of these kinds of things, whether they are actually functional or have logical coherence. Put all the actual philosophy outside of the conversation. We're dealing with the material consequences of it. So it has become our responsibility to do this kind of thing. Like, it's a challenge to us to kind of fulfill these grand psychological philosophical traditions. Whether we can do it or not is a completely different conversation. And a lot of the people you're going to confront are not going to be able to. They're not going to want to, for the internally self-justifying reasons that we've already discussed. That's the first, and it often cases the ultimate barrier to any of this ever materializing. But yeah, just as, because we kind of got halfway to the end of the conversation right there, and I just wanted to kind of clear that up a little bit. But
well, let me throw in one quick thing just as context, and this isn't to push back. You know, I'm not here to argue with you about it. I'm here to listen. But I would, as a clarification exercise, say that there's the idea, for example, of going after the wider public. You know, and I like to conceive of that as public, right, with a C and a K at the end. Ye old public, right? The them. And that's the general idea of conversion, right? Hey, brother, have you heard the good news, right? And there is a whole lot of discussion that is going on and has been going on in the sort of, you know, everybody likes to say in our circles, with the circles within circles, the sub-circles, you know, channels like Academic Agent and Charlemagne and Aaron McIntyre and some of these guys that, you know, I move in proximity to. And it is the idea that there is no need to go for any kind of a mass conversion. So be aware that the project at this point is simply to identify ways to communicate with people. And as I said, this is like a first gate. If you think about it, like in advertising, they talk about a sales funnel, right? And so you got this wide opening. I often like to think of it as the hell mouth, you know, from manuscript illuminations. But, you know, you're trying to reach this broad group of people, but by the time you actually close a deal, it's going to have narrowed considerably. So when I talk about a gate, it's not exactly a sales funnel, but imagine that funnel shape, because right now we're talking about what will apply most broadly to everybody. And so this is a very good time for you to make the points that you're making, which is, first off, this is going to be potentially something that can't even be overcome in terms of resistance. The vast amount of people aren't going to be interested in it. And as you pointed out, really, at the end of the day, it's not our problem anyway. We're not the ones who are bent, right? However, if, for example, we wanted to take this and go into the kind of segmentation I was talking about earlier, then there is the idea of quote unquote elite capture, you know, which arguably is something that has shaped our circumstances more than anything else in the United States and the West in general. So, you know, if you think about this in terms of narrowing the focus, instead of thinking about hitting people broadly all over the joint, then I think it becomes, while still challenging, a little bit more realistic to imagine that you could have an impact. If, for example, you said, I just wanted to target millennial artists in major urban areas who are producing works of art that reach X audiences, right? As soon as you begin to parcel these things out, there is room potentially to, while still challenging, to have this have some effect. So just to throw that out there, I'm not here to convert the masses.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go on here, I'm just going to cut my screen for a moment because I have to blow my snout, so I'm not waving tissues around on here while you're speaking. We've got tons of pollen in the air, so please go on. I'm still here. I'll be back in just a second.
So just to continue on the, you know, primary or secondary benefit of guilt, this is another finding of the Harvard Business Review, a separate study, that guilt, from a social perspective, guilt is linked with high performance, with leadership. It's people, in other words, people who are guilt prone are harder workers. They tend to be perceived more as leaders. They tend to actually be in positions of leadership, and that makes a kind of intuitive sense. People who are self-responsibilizing are kind of widening their sphere of agency in some way, whether real or imagined, as we've kind of already discussed. The more high agency responsibilizer is literally, they're stealing agency from other people. That's ultimately what happens with high agency guilt prone individuals. They're like agency vampires. They're sucking the agency of people around them. Did you want to? I
was just going to say that's very, very interesting vis-a-vis the whole thing of the learned helplessness crew and the guilty crew and the way they fit together. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's not to say good or bad one way or the other. It's just a fact. That's what those people tend to do. They're reckoning with the fact that the people around them are lower agency, and so they're doing things. 'Cause, hey, no, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it, right? It doesn't get done unless I do it. So there's that kind of mentality happening there. So guilt, from a social perspective, guilt is linked with dutifulness. It's linked with leadership. And so you're also pushing up against, in a Sisyphean kind of way, you're pushing up against social status, self-concept, the striver psychology. So, I mean, these are also things to keep in mind. Guilt is also closely related with other neoliberal values, namely empathy and compassion. So, it's also an effect, just on the leadership position, it's an effective influencer. It's an effective means of influencing, technology of influence. I'm leaning on your moral compass by invoking guilt to get you to behave the way that I want you to behave. So there's just a lot of power to it. It's a social technology. Guilt and shame are two probably of the most powerful social technologies. Certainly they're the ones that we squeeze the most juice out of. Doesn't make them the best. In fact, I don't think guilt and shame are necessarily the best. I think there are higher social technologies for influencing people. They're just harder to achieve, to actualize. But I mean, these are some things to keep in mind about guilt. And so just on the idea of guilt as a secondary benefit, as a kind of pleasure, if you want to use Lacanian language, there's an element of jouissance with it. It's a kind of over pleasure that's being derived from something almost bordering into the pathological. You're going beyond the limits of pleasure into pain, and that's this kind of guilt that we're talking about has both of those elements in it. And so the associative principle comes back into this, because taking that same theme and just pivoting in a slightly different direction, guilt reinforces certain activities through associative principles that reinforces that and makes us more likely to behave in that particular way. This was something I've heard people say before, not to get crude with you and your audience, or lewd, actually. I've never experienced it. I don't understand this at all, but I've heard people say when they masturbated or engaged in certain kinds of sexual conduct, they felt dirty when it was over. And that over time, that dirtiness was part of the fun of doing that activity. Now,
well, think about the flush of shame, right? The blush of shame that physically appears on the skin. And think about that, for example, when somebody says something really great about you, right? And you kind of blush because everybody's looking at you, and you're like, wow. And but you've even got little damn emojis, right? They go, ooh, like looking down at the ground, but they show the red cheeks specifically on this damn thing that's supposed to be an emotional indicator. And those emojis are a subject for a whole other semiotic evaluation because of what's going on there. And it's evil as hell. It's like, cartoons being used as a social engineering tool in Japan that infantilizes the entire population. But we don't have time to go into that. Anyway, you've got the blush, to your point. You've got the blush of pride. And it is a reaction to having been, even if it's feigned, but generally blushes are real. It's a reaction to having been pushed forward and everybody's looking at you, right? And and it's a pleasure response. Just like a post-orgasmic flush, right? Like if you look at a woman, or cheeks are red, this area up above the chest has turned red around the neck and the rest because there's the vascular stuff at the surface of the skin. But then look at the blush of shame. And so the multivalence of what you're talking about is right there, because there's a blush of pleasure, there's a flush of shame. And the way in which they dovetail with each other, is something to bear in mind. But you were taking that somewhere.
Yeah. So just that the negative feeling, the guilt or the shame that comes out of doing something that you like, but there's some kind of taboo around, or it's excessive in some way, reinforces the feeling of guilt. And so I guess to make this more obviously connected to the larger theme that we're talking about, white guilt, white saviorism, these things are intrinsically kind of self-reinforcing because they, oh gosh, I shouldn't have thought of this black person in that way. They feel bad about it. The feeling bad
then they feel good about feeling bad.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for making that clear for me. I was struggling a little bit, but yeah. So, and that's very particular to the the thrall of intersectional progressive liberal ideology, right? That's probably not. I still think you kind of see that with conservatives, although it's a little bit more like juvenile and puerile, like it is like a kid putting their hand in the cookie jar and getting caught by mom and going ha ha ha. It's a different type. You could say, and I don't mean this in a positive way, it's more sophisticated when you see it, that kind of behavior in a left liberal type. Not a compliment, just kind of my observation there. So yeah, it's reinforcing. So it's reinforcing on this deep biological level. It's reinforcing on this social level. It's reinforcing on a psychological level. Two quick further points on this idea of guilt, and then we can talk about resolution, and hopefully there's time to move on to some of the other subjects you wanted to discuss. You were talking earlier about the past, present, future, the temporal nature of guilt and identity, and that was something I wanted to kind of quickly reinforce. Guilt perpetuates the self-identity as being bad, as being evil, whatever the case. And if we want to think in terms of the self-flagellating white liberal or whoever, the male feminist ally, pick your archetype of stupid. There's a confusion of the action or the behavior with the self, the core kind of self-concept, the existential aspect of the person. And I think if you are focusing on the behavior or the habit, then you're thinking in terms of present and future, things that can be changed, things that can be reconsidered, apply an introspective lens and modify them in some way. But the I am bad because I did X bad thing is conflating the action with the actual person committing the action, and retrospectively or retrojectively projects that backwards, locking a person into a kind of past temporality or fixedness that further perpetuates the guilt, further reinforces the self-identity of bad. That's why you see these kinds of white liberal types that are like, well, we'll never get rid of racism, we'll never get rid of white supremacy, we're always evil now, forever, the past, present, future. There's a lot of aspects to this that are self-reinforcing. Last point, I'll give you the floor, and then we can talk about actual prescriptive conduct. Guilt and depression are also very closely related. Inappropriate, excessive guilt is related to depression. They correlate with one another. I think that this is a cultural and economic phenomenon, or a socioeconomic phenomenon. Mark Fisher has written about this. He talks about depressive hedonism. This is people who learned helplessness, lost futures. These are all kind of Fisherian concepts. People have no sense of a aspirational hope for the future. It was robbed from them. It was taken from them. And so people are in this perpetual kind of present temporality where they're shit, they're bad, things are awful, everything's ugly. So I'm going to smoke pot, go to these, year-long seasonal festivals, depressive hedonism. I just want escapism, effectively, is part of that. So that excessive guilt, I think, is not just a biological phenomenon. I think it's not just a social phenomenon or a psychological phenomenon. In his book, Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher maps out the economic cycle of bubbles and the booming bubble or the busting bubble. Sorry, it's late in the day, sort of. And, you have these kind of manic crescendos, and then the bubble bursts, and then there's a cratering, economic cratering. He traces the gigantic increase in certain pathologies like bipolar disorder, manic disorder, depression, as basically following this economic trajectory. And I think other people have commented on the kind of desacralizing of debt from the religious sphere into the economic sphere. And I would say it goes out of the economic sphere into the psychological sphere, into a kind of guilt and shame, basically taking on these psycho kind of spiritual dimensions that were previously in the economic and religious spheres. So I do think that there's a...
Who is it that talks about that? Because I'd not come across that idea.
Mark Fisher.
Mark Fisher. Go on.
Capitalist Realism by Zero Books. So it's just a problem that has a lot of layers and is being compounded and enforced at almost every level of the human experience. So that's the problem you're dealing with, as I see it.
Right, Sisyphean for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you had anything to that, I do have some resolutions.
Well, okay, so just to yeah, I might, but let me understand what the part is that you were going to move to next was strategies for getting around it.
Yeah,
or breaking through, so to speak. Okay. Yeah, I just want to throw a couple things by you. I was digging through a bunch of books that I inherited from my dad, and this one had a number of interesting things in an article. But first, just want to kind of throw these into the pot to get your thoughts, if any, on them, and just get them out there to the audience as well. What's interesting is this is a chapter on what they call self-conscious emotions: embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt, which they kind of look at as a constellation. And the first thing that they talk about is that there's a whole set of earlier emotions that that you deal with when you're younger, like aggression, right? These kinds of fear, and they require less in the way of self-consciousness, right? So
they're other conscious.
These earlier ones are, I'm not even sure if they're other conscious. They don't require a reflexive awareness to the same extent, right? You can be a baby and be terrified by something and begin crying. And I'm not, the reason I hesitate to say that they're other conscious is because I'm not even sure that self and other are fully differentiated at that point, right? With the earliest onset of some of these things, it's just like I am the sky and the sky is now gray and crying, so to speak. That's some half-assed poetic metaphor. But the point is that as you get further on in life, you have this idea of reflexivity, and you're looking inward to yourself, and how you look inward towards yourself is shaped to a considerable extent by what they gloss here as SRGs, which is an acronym for standards, rules, and goals, right? And as they note here, this author, these SRGs are inventions of the culture that are transmitted to children and involve their learning of and their willingness to consider these SRGs as their own. So you've got that idea of internalization, standards, rules, and goals get established. That there's this collective aspect. Obviously, this raises all kinds of interesting questions about their continuing focus on young people. From the 60s forward, it was definitely adolescence and sexuality, which I would expect is driven in large part by what a hard-on most of these people had for Freud. But now what we've seen, post Skinner and some of these other things is just going deeper and further and deeper back to target children at a younger and younger age. That's just a little side note. So here's another little pull quote. Thus, the distinction between emotions that require opinion or thought of others and emotions that do not suggests that two different kinds of cognitive processes are involved. That's the difference with, the younger emotions like fear and the rest versus or aggression versus this idea of these learned, these evaluative, self-conscious emotions. Another point here is, we can skip that one about Freud. They jump over here to Erikson once, and they're like, Erikson, in discussing shame, had no more success in distinguishing between shame and guilt than earlier psychoanalysts. I missed the Darwin quote. It was a good one from Darwin. Sorry. For example, Darwin, because he looked at the stuff with blushing. For example, Darwin believed that blushing, which could be a sign of either shyness, embarrassment, or shame and guilt, was caused by how we appear to others. So that dovetails with the idea of this socially imposed standards, rules, and goals, and then your failure to meet up with them or to meet those standards yields the shame or the guilt. Erickson turned to the more Darwinian view that when he suggested that shame arises when one is completely exposed and conscious of being looked at, in a word, self-conscious. And of course, we've seen the ways in which everything at all times, is sort of the Derrida phrase, it's always already focused on making you self-conscious. Be aware of how you operate in this space. Getting down to the level of pronouns, which were an utterly unconscious aspect of language. Like an adjective, you could think hard about, if you wanted to apply it. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Are you as beautiful as a rose or not? Is that an appropriate metaphor? Like linguistically, we would be perfectly willing to wonder whether or not the right noun was being applied, or the right adjective. But they've moved it into the realm of pronouns, which used to just come immediately to the tongue, and yet now they've introduced in that linguistic circuit a hesitation and an uncertainty and a self-consciousness. And of course, we've seen the same thing with, like, first it was, the N word, and then it was Negroes, like the United Negro College Fund, and then it was black because you couldn't say Negro, even though Negro comes from the Latin word, just like the N word does for black. And then it was, colored people, but then you can't say colored people, it's people of color. You see, again, they're introducing this self-consciousness in the same way they're doing with the pronouns. Everywhere there's self-consciousness, fear that you're not meeting the standards, rules, and goals. And that leads to a sense of guilt if you've violated that set of constraints, or shame, indeed. Now, although they show that, they suggest in this that shame has more to do with physical control of the body, some of these Freudian concepts of defecation or whatever, or potty training as a child, or association with the genitals and the rest, whereas they see guilt as being something a little more having to do with that later phase of when you're self-conscious. But what's very interesting is they have this one little square here. It's broken out into quadrants, and let me see if I can get this to be on screen. I should have set up a graphic of it, but it's very interesting to me because it parallels what you were talking about in terms of sort of learned helplessness over on one side and the guilt, and yet the guilt is an aspect of agency. It's sort of laid out here, if you can see it down in this section.
Yeah, it's a little fuzzy though.
Is that clear enough to read?
Global, specific, failure, success. I can't see quite what's in them. Shame.
Let me see if I can.
Pride. Yeah, I think I see it.
Yeah, well, I can do this. This might help. Just so everybody can check it out. Let me switch off of. No, that's not the one I want. That's the one I want. There we are. That might help. Is that visible? Or
yeah. It just blurs out too much, but guilt bottom right corner, shame top right,
and hubris
pride, bottom left. Okay, that's what it says.
And you see how it says success and failure. So you've got that like two sides of the same coin thing, and the other one is global and specific. So anyway, that's just an interesting way that they map out, the hubris and shame, the pride and guilt or regret, global, specific, success versus failure. That just I think that's a diagram I'm going to be looking at a bit further, because that aspect. Whoops, sorry, Josh. That aspect of the fundamental summary of what we've talked about with this first phase, and now I'll very happily turn it over to you, unless you have some further observations about this part, is that you'd imagine that you're going to go in and rescue them from guilt, and the immediate response you're likely to get if you take that approach is, rescue me from what? This is not only what I'm accustomed to, which is its own barrier to overcome, just habit, sheer habit, but it's actually a warm and fuzzy place for them, because the parameters, the dimensions of it are known. There is a certain kind of reward, and it comes with very, very little risk. There are some people who have success and can experience hubris and pride, whether positively or negatively construed as a result of their success, and they get agency. But for those who aren't particularly successful and never will be, the closest they're ever going to get to having a taste of an emotion associated with a real sense of agency is guilt, and that aspect of how it's turned backwards. So anyway, Were there any other points just before we move on to which you talked about as maybe ways to, the slow blade penetrates the shield to break through, or, prescriptive? Is there anything else you wanted to say to summarize what we did look at?
No, I mean, frankly, that graph and the implications of that opens up a whole other can of worms, so to speak. So maybe it's just better to put it back on the shelf for now. But no, I think we got, as far as the first part, I think that's all good and well. So just to touch on, the funnel, capturing those, the sellable clients, so to speak. Interestingly, the idea that guilt is about accountability fails ultimately because we find a higher affect or practice that not only increases accountability, but kind of eliminates a lot of these problems, roadblocks that we've been talking about, which is forgiveness. Forgiveness increases accountability more so than guilt, and it eliminates these kinds of self-attacking cognitions and antisocial technologies that have all of the ramifications that we've been talking about. Now, predominantly, that's self-forgiveness. So you're looking back at the version of you that did that awful thing, that made you a bad person. Forgiveness of that person actually elevates, well, it releases, it stops the production of these stress hormones, releases other more feel-goody chemicals in the body, and enables people to engage in a wider, basically to enact greater agency in the world around them. So you want to educate people, expose them to forgiveness as a alternative strategy for mistakenness. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, is mistakenness. People are doing something, it's not the right thing, they're socially censored or pressured or exposed to some kind of punitive judgment or action as a result of that mistakenness. Forgiveness punctures that and opens up a whole other set of options for people. And it's not just
very quickly. It seems to me this is a good point to make, that you hold out the. I was first thinking that, well, if you take the guilt away from them, then you've taken their huggy bear, right? That gives them an identity that they cling to, and in part because of what we just laid out in terms of the agency, right? It's a way for people with very little agency to feel as though they have a ton, because if they didn't, how could they be the ones who are responsible, having fucked everything up, right? Mm-hmm. And so anything that you would have to come at them to approach them to get them out of that, first off, realistically, if they're people who haven't seen through it already, for the most part, most of them are not going to have a whole bunch of agency one way or another. So that's a place for them to be able to live where they feel like they have something. And I'm like, well, how do you move them off of that? However, what you just talked about, this is a very interesting point, because the forgiveness, as you said, is an increased sense of agency, because now they're responsible. It's just like, you cheat on your girlfriend. She says, oh, this one time I'll put up with it because I really love you, and then she's, you're like, well, I can never do that again, right? I'm a changed man. But let's leave aside the real statistics on how often that works out. But that idea of the guy who's like, no, I love her. I've turned over a new leaf, right? Like you talk about, it's a sense of increased responsibility. I've been forgiven, but that means now I'm held to a higher standard because I'm not going to do that thing that I was forgiven for again. So that's a really interesting opening, because you can hold out the promise of feeling as though you have yet further agency if it's framed right. This is why I butted in, though, because this is basically just me restating what you said. Don't we already see that that is on offer as a part of the strategy too, right? If you can be a global multinational corporation and have screwed everybody out of everything. You can have sweatshops in Asia where the Filipino women have to urinate in plastic bags, hanging from under their little sewing machine desks, and sleep under them too. And yet, if you put a rainbow flag on your shoe, then you've said, oh, maybe I did something wrong. I can be forgiven all these other things, or at any rate, those other things can be forgotten about. and now I'm held to a higher standard. I'm with you, right? I realize it's not the same thing. It's more of a Potemkin village of that process. But here's the easiest way to phrase it. Don't we see a strategy like the one you're talking about already employed, though arguably it could be done better by the people over there on the so-called left? They say that you're terrible, you have white guilt and all the rest, but if you become an ally and you let black people speak before you do, and you obey the hierarchy of the progressive stack, and you make this a safe space for others, and you ritually flagellate yourself enough, then you'll be forgiven. And there's this further level of agency you can take on without still having to do anything except annihilate yourself.
There's a lot there. Two things, and hopefully a possible third, if I don't forget it. So in addition to forgiveness is remorse. So there actually has to be, forgiveness is a public, good Lord. So these are acts that are attributed to the self. Okay, that's ground one. The problem with guilt and the things that we've been discussing so far is that they're outwardly directed. They're in a neoliberal frame, which is other focused and not quite so much self-focused. And so when I said before that guilt correlates with other neoliberal values like empathy and compassion, they are always empathy towards the other, compassion for the other. Whereas the kind of like eusocial, eudaimonic, almost healthful way of doing this is directing those things inwardly. So compassion to the self, empathy for the self. Remorse is something I feel about my conduct towards myself. And the forgiveness is I'm forgiving myself, right? So I think I think I got all three of them there. So I'll try to put it together more neatly. Fundamentally, the difference is that these are, like you're saying before, I forget the exact word you use, self-annihilation, self-antagonism, whatever it was. There's a repressive tone to the style of strategy that is being implemented by neoliberal progressives that you're describing. I think fundamentally the strategy is the same, but the tone, the undercurrent, the telos, so to speak, is fundamentally different. So now you're almost getting on like a meta psychological level, where or a meta behavioral level, where it's not just the things that you're doing, but the why and the how and the for whom of the actions themselves. So I was thinking a lot actually before when you invited me to this program. There's a truism that I think is so true, it's slid into self-mockery lately, but it's common in these circles. Take your own side, which is, it's like so, for us, it's like so self-obvious that, and it's repeated so much to become a cliche, but it is very much resonant to and relevant to these kinds of things, because it fundamentally presupposes that there's a kind of internal awakening of consciousness that precedes all of these other strategies, actions, analyses that we're doing. That has to come first. And maybe to even kind of take all this highfalutin stuff we've been talking about the last hour and a quarter, fundamentally, there has to be that paradigm shift, change in consciousness that the person experiences that precludes anything else that comes after it. So yeah, there's a superficiality to Raytheon nuking a small village of Iraqis and then putting a pride flag, outside of the corporate office. It's more about signaling and superficiality and conformity that doesn't really get at what the purpose of a strategy like this is. It's cynical, it's Machiavellian, it's in that cluster of what's called the dark triad in personality psychology: Machiavellianism, psychoticism, narcissism, which are basically like the human recipe for a total douchebag of a person. They are manipulative, they are self-involved, and they've had severe breaks from the kind of collective reality that we all participate in. So, I mean, does that get it? Kind of your question or rebuttal there?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I think
So yeah,
I'm with you.
so forgiveness, remorse, because remorse is a past tense cognitive activity. It's about that guy 6 weeks ago, 6 months ago, 6 years ago, who is not me. So there's a kind of a discontinuity in your self-concept, which facilitates this process. You're looking at yourself as having stages or progressing in some way in terms of your self-concept. In Piagetian language, you would say there's an accommodation of your schema. Something has changed. You're molding the way that you're viewing a particular thing to be more in conformity with reality, or the reality that you would like to be creating, constructing, whatever, not to get wacky about it. Fundamentally, we need to cultivate introspection and self-inquisition. So the reflexivity that you were talking about before obviously is going to play a role in this. You asked before, how would this look in a clinical setting? I mean, literally, it would be like, why do I feel that particular type of guilt in that particular circumstance? What is the result of that particular style of guilt? What does it offer to me? You're putting yourself on trial and examining the motivations for the feelings that you're having. Of course, it presupposes you don't want to be that way anymore, but you have to fundamentally look at the structure of the motivations that are there. Because,
well, here's a big point that in a clinical setting, and this occurs to me, it has all kinds of implications. It should be like 101 topic to be covered here, but most of the people you're dealing with in a clinical environment, I guess, unless they put in some sort of state institution where their treatment or therapy is mandated, the first thing that you're dealing with there is that they're people who have come to you. Mm-hmm. Whatever it is within themselves, right? Or you can even look at it, to step outside of quote unquote clinical, look at like an AA meeting, right? They don't go mm-hmm. around to go find other people. People, come in for the delicious coffee and donuts, they arrive there and they're allowed to leave, right? Which is a big theme of that. If they don't want to be there, they can walk out the door, right? So that's an interesting point, that they've already self-selected to a considerable extent because they recognize there's enough of a problem to go talk to a therapist. And you cannot count on that. I mean, unless you get into some serious psychographic segmentation and targeting, you can't count on that when you're engaging in any sort of more broad communication strategy. Sorry, I just want to put an underline under that too, because that's a very important point. Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of one of the other bullet points I wrote down here is you want to cultivate the inner authoritarian, which I think is fundamental to this as well. I make a sort of argument in my book.
Oh yeah, act now, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll put a link. I'll go ahead and stick that in the comments now. Actually,
appreciate it. There's a certain, they're not perfect homologies or synonyms, but agency and authority, very closely related. And I guess I say cultivate your inner authoritarian. I mean, I personally believe that, so I'm not just being cute or edgy. But for people who are not quite that far down the path, it is a very extreme or radical word to use to push people further in a direction that they're disinclined to go. So if you are low agency, timid, if you want to think of things in a Nietzschean way, the slave, then the authoritarian is on the opposite pole from where you are. And the more radical a metaphor or a endpoint, I find the makes it the journey there is clearer. It's illuminated in some way. I'm having a difficult time putting it exactly into the way I want to phrase it, but the strength of the language is a self-motivating factor in getting people out of this disposition. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say. So again, to the, how would this look in a clinical setting? There is a discipline known as motivational interviewing. Basically, it's a kind of direct challenge, and I kind of highlighted some of this before, but it's a direct challenge to people's stated goals and outcomes using a kind of Socratic method. redirecting them towards new actions which might satisfy their stated goals or determine whether in fact the stated goals themselves need to be changed. And so the 5 tenets of this method would be to express empathy, to develop. So obviously these people need to feel like you're not antagonizing them. To go back to the very first thing here I said, like saying something like, "Hi, I'm from Dissident Right Inc. and I would like to have a dialogue with you, sir." It's like you're setting up an antagonism, which will sully everything.
Business card with a swastika on it. You're like, "Hey, have you heard the good news?" They're like, "Get fucked." Right? Yeah, I hear you.
Exactly. So you're expressing empathy. They feel safe. It's one of the reasons why. You mentioned AA before. It's a safe space to use that phrase.
Just to clarify for all the people who follow Academic Agent, he's talking about Alcoholics Anonymous here. Right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So you're expressing empathy. Tenet 1, Tenet 2, develop discrepancy so that people can actually see the distinction between the versions of themselves that they're inquiring into. Avoiding arguments, really, really important. You're not there to fight these people. You're ostensibly there to help them. And so it's not the same thing as avoiding contentious topics, but it is, and this ties into the next tenet, which is roll with resistance. You're not antagonizing them. They're going to antagonize you. And I mean, theoretically, you're the more mature, sophisticated, enlightened person in this conversation. You ought to be acting that way. If you can't act it, you should not be engaging in this kind of activity in the first place, because you're not the one. So stop, put away the swastika business card and find another hobby. Avoid arguments, roll with resistance, support self-efficacy. Another way of saying that is we want these people to develop agency. And so in terms of how you do that, 4 steps. You engage with them. So it's not you're delivering a monologue. They're not delivering a monologue either. Kind of like in therapy, they should be doing more of the talking than you, which is why I like that Socratic approach where you're just kind of nudging and prodding and slightly instigating and challenging certain things. And from that engagement, you're going to, the 3 important questions: what, why, and how. What is this about? Why is this the way that it is? How are we going to go about changing it? And fundamentally, you kind of have to ask those questions to get any movement in, on that continuum that we talked about earlier. And,
so it seems like, in a certain sense, any success in therapy, or however you want to characterize it, it's almost like sucking on a siphon. When you want to get like gas out of your tank or whatever, the first movement of the fluid that leads to the constant flow is them recognizing there's enough of a problem to come in and start, to seek someone to engage with, and to, and from that point on, once you get that pull, so to speak, the siphon works because you just listen quietly. You listen to them talk about what you say, the what, the why, and the how were they. It occurs to me that's all that's happening there is you're listening, and hopefully at some point, not to give it all away, they will have enough self-awareness, reflexive awareness, however you want to say it, to begin to see for themselves what they themselves are saying. You're trying to kick, it's like trying an old kickstart on a motorcycle. You're trying to kick it over and have it catch to where they begin to say, "Hey, wait a minute, I can understand these things about myself," and you're just there to sort of shepherd the process and occasionally throw in some recommendations to keep them on it, but they're going to have to be a self-starter about it.
Yeah. So exactly, 100% exactly. Just to speak from actual experiences doing this, again, if you're the person with the business card, you're actually that person.
Just for a second, because I know that'll be clipped out later and used in some ridiculous way. I'm not a big fan of mid-century Germans. I use that as a joke, just so people understand. I do not endorse the use of the swastika, blah, 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 blah.
What is that? Who are these people? Exactly. I'm not even aware of it.
Yes.
So in like the actual experiences I and my friends have had doing this, if you're that guy, if you were chosen by God, so to speak, to have this mission to be the proselytizer, people will recognize it and they will approach you first, and they're going to see that in these deeply unconscious, your gait, your posture, the tonality of your voice, how much eye contact you make. Like, you've probably seen all these studies of biological level genetic predictors of right-wing political orientation, your gait, testosterone level, the tone of your voice, how much eye contact you make, the firmness of your handshake, the structure of your face. All the kind of people are going to see this, and they're going to know right away, whether they know it or not, this is the person I can talk to about this. And they're going to come to you and they're going to talk about, again, they don't even know what they're telling you. On some level, they know, like on a deep, deeper than subconscious level, that repetition compulsion, the enantiodramy, the Renaissance magic that you were talking about earlier, the magnetic pull is dragging them to you, and and you'll be that shepherd and you'll facilitate this whole process. But they will know that you're the person. What's the old saying? When the student arises, there shall be the master, or something like that. I forget exactly.
When the student is ready, the teacher arrives.
Appears.
Yeah, appears.
Yes, we did it together.
Yay!
That's exactly, I think, what it comes down to. And so that kind of even solves the issue of, like, we're not appealing to mass man. We're not trying to puncture the fantasy of every normie. You're going to put out a message, or you're just going to be you, that will naturally attract people. And the only people who are going to slip, past the goal, you're going to be those people who are kind of in a predetermined way inclined to this. And just by the sheer force of propaganda, the culture industry pulled them away from their natural inclinations. People like you, myself, some of the other folks you mentioned on this stream already. That's why we have audiences. People see us, even if they don't really understand what we're about, they're like, yes. And then they stick around, So is that lesson one complete? Or
yeah, but that's very, very interesting. Now, were you going to move on to another one, or were you?
So I had a little. I guess I did have a little bit here to say about denial. If there's anything else you wanted to say about guilt.
Well, well, I have one I'm going to say, but to help me remember it so I don't lose it. What we just talked about there was obviously the one-on-one kind of interaction, and it has all its own challenges, in a therapeutic environment where, you're a therapist or psychologist or whatever, or counselor, whatever it might be, whether you're dealing with CBT or you've got, or you've got a Freudian, or, however that works out. The issue that you're dealing with is that that's a one-on-one arrangement, and that brings with it things like, for example, transference, and all sorts of other things that, you have to be aware of. However, in this case, and again, we can come back to this after the what was it, denial part you were just thinking about. But this is different because this is very likely going to be, at least at the outset, mass communication. Or let me qualify that. I don't mean like mass communication. But if, for example, we say it would be great if we had a whole bunch of filmmakers who were right-wing, and we want to capture that square on the board because it yields control of this set of cultural institutions that will allow us to create, in the same way, for example, that all these films have embedded, camouflaged social justice messages. So we say, well, what we want to do is we want to say, if we can get a mythical 1% return on our direct mail, so to speak, trying to reach content creators who produce feature films, we're going to want to target them. So what I'm trying to say is it's not mass communication, but it would be a situation definitely where you do not have a one-on-one relationship with any of these prospects that you're trying to reach and overcome resistance in. So I'd love to hear you talk about denial. Don't want to derail that, so I'm going to shut up now. But if perhaps once you're done with that, again, I said this so I don't forget, we can come back to this idea of, how do we do this when it's just text on a page or a clip, or a poster or a flyer or a meme, right? And I realize there are limitations, but that's a very different thing than a one-on-one personal relationship.
So let's put denial on the back burner for a second, because that's something I've given a lot of thought to. I'm sorry, Oliver. In my book,
Do it, brother. I just posted it in the description for the video. So if anybody's interested, the link is there.
I mean, I specifically wrote it with the intent of cutting across every conceivable demographic of person that could read it. Now, there's some people have told me that it was too highfalutin, too many $6 million words in it. Not a whole lot I can do about that, I suppose. I am a stick up my ass intellectual, and that's not something I'm willing to sacrifice. But I mean, I did intentionally write it such that, you know, people are picking it up and they're not getting a whiff of ideology. And you know, that's a real challenge to kind of to go through that level of self-erasure, that your priors are not bleeding through. I find is very difficult to do. I think most people find that very difficult, very laborious. There's a famous Emil Kieran quote, something to the effect of, you know, to be objective is like against nature. You know, how could you not have your position or your stance and advocate for it all the time? I'm putting words in his mouth. But people are so cynical in their media consumption, and they are so suspicious, and frankly, the views that we represent are so maligned, that we have to take several additional steps in that pre-suasion kind of mentality, just before we even show up. You know, it used to be, you know, look nice, good cologne, get a good suit on, shake your hand, here's a business card, here's your elevator pitch. Okay, I'll call you Monday. Now it's like there's a lot more prep work that has to go into it. I like to think of, calling to mind Mark Brahman's work, which is in some Apollonian Transmission for people in the audience who might not know him. He's a colleague of Richard Spencer and so forth. You know, his work is very heavily focused on symbolism and kind of embedding themes and concepts into imagery and things like that. And so when you're doing something like this, where it's not a one-on-one campaign, I mean, you have to really, really think about what you want to convey and how you want to convey it. And you really have to put yourself in the perspective of the person who is going to be receiving that. So it's a lot of homework that you have to do. I don't think I can be particularly clear on this point, because I think it's a work in progress for most people. And everyone who engages in this activity is going to have their own solution to the problem, so to speak. And they're also going to think differently about what has primacy in terms of what people will respond to, what you feel they need to know, how you feel they need to be reached. So every individual person doing that is going to come to different conclusions. But I mean, I would say in the grand or in the broad, you kind of have to be painstakingly nonpartisan to the degree that that's possible, as far as writing is concerned. And that's what I know. That's what I can speak to. You know, the less, oh gosh, I don't know. We're on YouTube. Not a good example. I'll clean it up a little bit. Andrew Joyce, maybe you know, great writer, historian, talked about researching a particular subject and finding that he was not satisfied with the researchers because they had brought too much spiritedness to their arguments, and that contaminated the argument for him. And then he came across more contemporary writers who took a kind of dispassionate scientific approach, and it was free of bile and venom, and it was, you know, just the facts, ma'am, and it changed him. And I think that, you know, if you're doing like academic writing, you know, it's not the same thing as literary writing. It's not the same thing as poetry. I think maybe in literary writing and poetry, you're muted, so I'm not hearing you.
Oh, sorry, or ad copy for that matter. Yeah.
Right. Yes, exactly. Then these rules probably don't really work out too much for you.
Right. Well, my strategy isn't specifically to address questions like Joyce's, because Joyce seems to be doing a bang on job of, you know, of what he's doing. And for me, at any rate, that is a peripheral question. I recognize a lot of people, it's central, right? For me, it tends to be peripheral. But in terms of and I get that you just brought it up because it's an example, right? Because you got a hot button topic. How do you present it to people? You know, why not go ahead and take a look at an example of one of the hottest button topics, right? But I think it's fair not to expect too much from you in this respect, because of the psychological, or even if you're dealing with hypnotherapy. One of my good friends had studied that for quite some time, and a lot of people might poo-poo it, but you're directly getting with someone, moving them into a state of mind. I mean, if there wasn't anything to hypnosis, then why, for crying out loud, would people even have comfortable sofas for psychologists? You know, there is something to get people to relax, to reduce their barriers, to change their state of consciousness, to hopefully put themselves in tune with other things that they wouldn't, you know. I mean, you get into all kinds of stuff related to physical posture and state of mind, from yoga to, you know, Alexander technique. Anyway, so yes, it's a serious approach. It has bearing, but all these things that you're involved with in that respect, leaving the writing aside, do require one-on-one. So I wouldn't try and wring too much out of you in that respect. The points you made about writing, they make sense to me, certainly, but I can pick it up from there, just because my thing is about mass communication. I just wanted to run that, you know, because, you know, dealing with advertising, all that stuff, I just wanted to run that by you, just to see if you had anything, you know, front loaded or in your hip pocket on it, because it does seem like it's going to be a challenge. You know, it's a very different animal when it's a one-way push message. As opposed to two people in interaction. And there are some things made available by the nature of interactive space. We used to call it interactive in the late 90s. Yes, I work for an interactive company. We do CD-ROMs. We know how to make animations in Flash, you know, but I think that's something to get with technologists about, you know, one, just to make a mental note for myself in the course of this stream. You know, one of the challenges is the seeming push communication, and the way in which it's not it's not reciprocal. And so, you know, maybe you talk to some people who are developers or coders, and you say, is there a new metaphor, a new interface metaphor, a new form of interaction that will allow us some of the reach of quote unquote mass communication, with the same low parentheses? We're not talking about reaching everybody, it might be targeted, but, you know, can we get a feeling of it being a reciprocal communication, but at scale, using some technological or interface metaphor or concept? But anyway, that's just an asterisk to stick into the conversation. But did you have anything further you wanted to say on that? And I would love to hear what you were going to throw out there with denial also.
There's some things rolling around there, but let's stay on track, because I think we could probably keep going. It's fascinating. Honestly, it is something I think a lot about, but I don't have a lot of lived experience, so to speak. So I don't want to stick to the expertise. Let's do that. Because you did mention denial, I think I have a little bit less to say on this subject, and we've been going at this for a little while. So I'm going to take a nap because I'm an old man. But some things on denial that I think are kind of, certainly in clinical practice, in the literature, and particularly in really political subcultures, you know, denial is something that is thought purely of in the negative. You know, in Freud, we think of denial as resistance, as pathological, not just Freud, psychoanalysis, the therapeutic tradition, we think of denial as an obstacle to some stated goal, or whatever the case might be. If you're a Marxist, I mean, you're like, gosh, how could these people, you know, the classic Marxian formula is, you know, like, how could these people want something that's against their interests? You know, how are they in denial about material historical analysis, or the bourgeois blah 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 blah? Or we might say, you know, how are people in denial about XYZ hot button political issue? And we often think of it as a roadblock, as an obstacle, as a kind of willful obstinance, maybe in stronger terms, which I don't need to elaborate too much. I think people can probably call to mind what those stronger terms might be. But I think it's worth pointing out the positive aspects of denial, what it does for people, why it's there, instead of thinking, you know, of denial as something that is keeping us from getting what we want. What is it that denial is getting for the denier, rather than what is it withholding from the deniee? So, you know, it is a positive adaptation for people, the inability to deal with things that are beyond their control. things that are beyond the schema of their world. It protects the integrity of their self-concept by distorting reality in a self-enhancing way. It promotes a sense of mastery and control. That's going to lower anxiety. It's going to lower cortisol levels. It'll keep people from slipping into despair and nihilism. It may actually make them better decision makers when they are confronted with stressful conditions. So, you know, it's something that helps people to move forward in the world. And there's a certain level of you know, we're bracketing out information that is not immediately relevant to our concerns. We all do that. We all do that all the time, especially in an informational overload kind of culture that we have. We bracket out more data than probably any group of people in human history. So it's just you know, you have to do it. And it goes back to something we said a little bit earlier, like it's ultimately not our responsibility. So isn't the person who's in denial of whatever, declining birth rates, demographics, certain political events like earlier in January, whatever the case might be, like, aren't they doing the right thing by denying all this stuff, denying it? I mean, they're not involved. They're not even tangentially involved. They might not even know anyone who's involved. There's no 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon going on where they could possibly insinuate themselves into the situation and develop an awareness or opinion of it. So, I mean, it's something that is good and natural and necessary. And, you know, speaking for myself, like, you know, these things really only, you know, I wasn't what was the word you used earlier? Praetorian super Chad from the birth. I wasn't that kind of person. But a lot of things stuck under my skin at a very early age. Some things came to me later. And a lot of the later arrivals were the immediate consequence of something encroaching on my life. And that kind of, I think, feeds back into the shepherd thing we were talking about earlier, where something's going to happen to these people and they're going to change on a dime. And if they were that kind of person in their constitution prior to that, then, you know, they're just going to make a beeline for you. So I think it's just more helpful to conceptualize denial as something that is, you know, an intrinsic part of the psychological makeup, something that is constitutive of a healthy approach to life, and less of a barrier and more of a
it's not a bug, it's a feature, right?
Thank you.
It's got it's got adaptive value, or damn it, it wouldn't have appeared. And I think that the hammering on that, because you did it with guilt too. And it seems, now that you've said it, it seems to be a relatively straightforward thing, like, oh yeah, but I was not approaching it from that direction. And I think that's that in and of itself. There are many other points that have been covered here that are helpful and interesting for me. And I love the expression, as I said before, political exorcism. You know, we're going to show up with holy water, you know, out, damn glibbo homo spirit. You know, it's just, that's not going to work, because these are adaptations. They're successful survival adaptations. Now, they have been weaponized, no doubt, with great cunning and malice aforethought. But the bottom line is that precisely these features that we're talking about, they are successful adaptations. They have their place. And, you know, you can pretty much guarantee that people aren't going to be like, oh, this is so awesome that you showed up to try and, you know, lift the veil from my benighted eyes and, you know, show me reality. They're like, you know, no, I'm you know, just like you talked about with the denial and the barriers and separation from a lot of the stuff that's going on. These are people who, because of that decision, given their current environment, they have not had to go through the crap you went through, you know. And I you know, I was not there, so to speak, but I was online and, you know, had interacted with you. So I traced some of that. That had to be hellish, you know. So it's like, you got to look at it and say, well, maybe there's something to their survival adaptations, you know. They're like, you can keep swatting flies over there while your career goes nowhere because you've been hounded out of polite society, you know, throw rocks at you until you stop moving. And they're like, you want me to come over to your side for what? So yeah, the positive valorization, anyway, I'm talking too much, but the positive valorization of these characteristics that we're inclined to dismiss as negative is an important first step towards tackling any of them.
Yeah, and I think maybe one final, I mean, you've mentioned it a few times, and this is something I thought about a lot. I'll get to the point I wanted to make. What happened to me, in scare quotes? Yeah, it was unpleasant. I wouldn't really like to go through it again. I'm fortunate that I came into this so late in the game that it was so relatively, what's the word I want to use? It was relatively less terrible for me than some people. And I mean, not that I knew these people personally, but some people who did that thing down in that state, a few summers ago, killed themselves when what happened to me happened to them. So my life is a net positive after all of this happening. And I'm not saying this is an encouragement to people to, hey, kids, do what I did.
Right. But they can only really do it to you once, though, right?
Oh yeah, right. It's like in sports, like in boxing, the losing your O only happens once. So some people are like, once it's over, it's like, oh, thank God, that terrible weight has been lifted off my shoulders. Now I can just compete, and I certainly feel better about myself and how to approach these kinds of issues now that it's over. There's nothing to lose. So just to that point, because I do think that there's a unhealthy paranoia about that whole process that doesn't quite match reality. Which isn't to say that my experience will be everyone's experience. I'm aware of that, but just my little nudge to put things in perspective. Anyway, you did mention weaponizing, and that was the kind of last point I had on this subject, which is that, I mean, denial is obviously a political weapon. And you see this, it's a pseudo-intellectual weapon, and it's a political weapon. And I come from a psychology background, and one of the funny things about it is that in the early goings of psychoanalysis, the retort by the psychoanalytic community to any of its critics were, well, you just don't understand psychoanalysis. You're in denial about the truths that psychoanalysis have brought to bear on the world. And so it's a responsibilizing, it's a psychopolitical machination where it's something that's wrong with you, buddy. We've got the little halo above our heads. We're perfectly angelic, enlightened, benevolent creatures, and you're just a smelly piece of shit. So it's your fault, partner. And it's worth keeping in mind how these kind of psychopolitical phenomenon are used really to prop up. And I actually do believe a lot in the value of psychoanalysis, but just as an example, are used to prop up these either partly or entirely faulty ideologies or systems or approaches to the world, or the implementation of these systems for malignant antisocial purposes. Well, I mean, you reject this because you're in denial, because it would hurt you, because I mean, you hear this all the time. Like, I guess it's maybe not an exact a comparison or elaboration, but it did come to mind, so maybe it's worth something. When some of these blue check mark types, I think they call them janitors now. That's what I hear some people call them, the discourse janitors. When they talk about like multiculturalism, yeah, I didn't coin it, but it is a phrase I like. Multiculturalism, people being economically displaced. They're like, well, what's the phrase they always use? A mediocre white guy. You just can't stand that you can't compete because you're a mediocre white guy. And it's like this total phenomenon of you clearly must have some repressed fear, or you must be in denial about the pathetic nature of your existence, or all of these things are used just to bludgeon people. And that's a factor in this whole kind of persuasion phenomenon. Like, what are the barriers that we're dealing with? Who are the people that are setting up these barriers? Why are they setting them up? I think that's all important. So that's my final.
It certainly stands out as a nice illustration of how offensive, alienating, and wrong it can feel to have a group of people come in and accuse you of denial and all the rest, right? In their case, they're not looking to convert, obviously, right? Because they view themselves as already having control, them, whatever that means. But they have the various people, technocrats, people who control the discourse, they're in a situation where they believe they already hold the high ground, so they have no need to convert. They can just try to contain, isolate, ostracize, right? And yet, this is an interesting example to raise because it shows you really, if we approach it as guilt and denial, and you're just angry, or envy is another big one. You're just envious of these other groups that are more successful. How off-putting that can be. So it's a good thing to say, look, the very things that you're talking about addressing in order to build a bridge and reach out to people and convince or convert or whatever, or give them something to think about. Those very techniques that we're talking about are also used to ostracize and belittle and, circumvallate, contain others. So yeah, that's a good warning, an excellent one. We're about 5 minutes out from close, and I'd like to get it in under 2 hours so that auto loads over to Odyssey and all this other stuff. Why don't you just take a full minute here and hold that damn book up and let us know what it's about. What's the damn
Thank
book
you, sir.
about? Yeah.
Appreciate it. So, American Extremist, The Psychology of Political Extremism, published by Imperium Press. They are, I think, the premier publishing house for people in our
circles
worldview. They've got a couple of books out. They are Imperium Press fashions themselves as a publisher of antiquities, but they've taken obviously new work from contemporary writers, and they just do fantastic work. And they're all wicked smart, and they've grown really quickly in a short time, which I think speaks to the value of the work that they do. So if you want to support me, I mean, I almost don't want you to support me. I would, if there was some way like it would all go to them. I don't want to like humble brag here too much. Obviously, a little cash in my pocket is nice, but they're a growing publishing house. They're fantastic. If you go to imperiumpress.org and purchase books from their website, they will get 100% of your money, as opposed to Amazon, who will take a lot of your and their money. So somebody in the chat says they published Thomas 777. They will be publishing him. He's writing a book on jurisdiction as relates to the Nuremberg trials. So they got a lot. I mean, they're going to publish like 20 more books this year. It's crazy what they're doing. Lots of rave reviews for the book. Kurt Doolittle, Andrew Joyce, Eric Stryker, Keith Woods, Joel Davis, Ed Dutton, pretty much everyone, Mark Collette, everyone you care about probably has read this and really, really loves it, which makes me really happy. So share in the experience. I think it's a very important book. I think it will be important for many, many years from here on out. And yeah, just go to Imperium Press. If you don't buy my book, buy their other books. They have, Chris Bond's Nemesis, fantastic piece of work. They publish writings by Jonathan Bowden, by Thomas Carlyle. Everyone you love is there. But please, please, please send your 5-star reviews and comments to Amazon.com so we can rub it in Jeff Bezos's face. Just don't give him your money. So
yeah, I totally agree with you in that respect. I have some books online, and listen, don't leave a review unless it's like 4 minimum 5 stars. I'm like, definitely, I want the 5-star reviews. I have no interest in the 1 or 2 stars, just to let everybody know. So yeah, everybody, please do check out Josh's book, most certainly, and Imperium Press, as you said. Thank you again for being on. I appreciate this. This has been very helpful. Lots of food for thought. I'm going to go back through this and listen to it again in a couple of days and make my notes, pull them in, and add it to the growing body of knowledge that will drive this exercise in strategic communication. So yeah, I thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. We have about 30 seconds left. Anything else you wanted to say?
It's been a real pleasure. I'm glad I could finally return the favor. I'm not just blowing up smoke up your behind. I think you're a fascinating guy. You do a lot of really interesting stuff. I'm glad you're doing this. And yeah, welcome to come back. anytime in the future if you're willing to have me.
I love it, man. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. And everybody who's watching, thank you for sticking with us this long. There will be more in the strategy series coming up much sooner than later. A bunch of interesting ideas going on in the background. They have to be finalized, but I'll make announcements about them when it gets sorted. So thank you all for being here. Until next time, I am Semiagok, and I am out.